Welcome to the 2024 Bampton Lectures, Lectures 3 and 4. My name is Jane Shaw and I'm Chair of the Bampton Trust, and it is of course our great delight and pleasure to have a scholar of distinction such as Rowan Williams to give these lectures. He has assured me that he would not like the long and fulsome introduction this week, so I think I'll just reiterate that it is a great pleasure and honour to have Rowan giving these fascinating lectures this year, and we're very grateful to Rowan for making time to do so. The two lectures will happen exactly as last week. We will have a coffee break at 11 and continue at 11:30. There'll be no questions, but there will be a seminar this afternoon to which everyone is warmly invited at 2 o'clock in the old library over there. And this will be kicked off with some questions and commentary from Professor Mark Jordan, who's the Eastman Visiting Professor here from Harvard this term, and then there will be opportunity for you all to discuss and ask questions. So thank you once again, Rowan, for doing this, and another huge welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane, and thank you all for turning up again, or possibly for the first time this week. Very good to be here. Last week, we were looking at some of the basics around the history of the concept of solidarity, and also at some of the critique that's been levelled against it as an ideal, some of the weaknesses or ambiguities around the idea of solidarity, which might steer us towards a dangerously sentimental or exclusive picture of what it might mean. I began to talk a little bit about some of the theological framing of the question, which I'll want to come back to in the second lecture this morning. But this third lecture is a little bit of a detour, in some ways, to address in slightly more detail some of the aspects of those ambiguities around the idea of solidarity that are crystallized in the word tribalism. Is solidarity simply a polite name for tribalism? Tribalism, that is, understood as an approach to the world and to various issues fundamentally to do with the solidarity of a defined group taking for granted their own perspective on the world. And of course, one of the ironies about the very word tribalism is that it's the kind of word that enlightened universalists use to describe other people. Tribalists are somebody else. If you pause to think about it, you'll see why that might be a little bit of an irony. And there's a fine phrase in a book by the Canadian poet and philosopher Jan Zwicky, who talks about the reluctance of the enlightened world to believe there is ever anything to be learned from those who are written off as tribalists in one way or another. But perhaps it's important in thinking about how the word tribalism works to distinguish between two kinds of collective solidarist identities. It's possible to inhabit an inherited identity, an inherited world of reference, with confidence and without embarrassment and without self-consciousness. It's also possible consciously to construct a tribal identity in an adversarial way, so that the way you know who you are is by knowing who you're not. And that difference between two kinds of tribalism, you might say, is the difference, shifting the register slightly, between tradition and traditionalism. Inhabiting a tradition is living unself-consciously in a particular framework of reference. To be a traditionalist is to have chosen to inhabit this framework rather than another. Now, current concerns in politics and social thinking about resurgent tribalism in various forms are not only, I think, about the degree of adversarial ferocity that surrounds so much debate these days. but what you might call the register of it. By this I mean that modern forms of tribalism, aggressive and mutually exclusive identitarianism, these modern forms presuppose that difference must always be radical. Identity then becomes inseparable from a kind of existential anxiety. The person or the community different from me is not simply different, but actively opposed, and not simply wrong, but deliberately wicked. If you look at a great deal of online debate, and I don't recommend it, then one of the things you will take away from that is precisely that assumption of the moralizing of every possible difference. Not that here is a distinction, a variation of approach, which may in some sense be understood within a common discourse, but here is somebody speaking a different moral language, somebody inhabiting a different moral universe. And that means, of course, because moral universes tend to be incompatible, that the very existence of the other is a threat to my security. If someone else disagrees, I can't really exist. And that moralizing, almost apocalyptic moralizing of difference, of distinction, in a lot of current debate, that assumption that opposition is evil and irrational, that means, of course, that the word recognition can't play very much of a part in contemporary exchanges. And I would say that one of the major problems we face in understanding a whole range of moral disagreements in our own time is the working assumption that the moral universe of the other is not recognizable to me. What the other wants, believes is good or desirable, is what I believe to be evil and undesirable and to be resisted. I cannot understand how a rational person could have those values or those goals. And that standoff, that assumption of total moral incompatibilism, seems to be a growing feature of the way in which a good many of our debates about major public and global events are conducted. I'll say it now and I'll be saying it again later on, that this does not mean that conflict or debate is a bad thing or a failure or whatever. It's something to do with whether recognition continues to play any part. I should say the possibility of recognition continues to play any part in our moral debate, in our conflicts. As I say, if the other's goals and values are radically unrecognizable, we have a problem. And of course, that has some impact also on how we understand our history. The evils of the past come to be seen simply as incomprehensible. How could anybody come to those conclusions? How could anybody believe that was right? And the shadow of that is the reactive denial of complexity or shadow in the past. Debates about the legacies of the slave trade come to mind here. On the one hand, there can be a simple and in its way bland assumption that our ancestors were simply stupid and wicked. Unreasonable. There could have been no reasons for them to act as they did. I would say that it's possible to believe that their judgments were flawed, that the results of those judgments were nightmarishly bad, and many such things, but that does not exempt us from the work of trying to see why it ever appeared to anybody that certain kinds of behavior were defensible. But the reaction is to pretend that there was nothing really wrong. And we see that reaction, of course, in quantity around the place. All right, the slave trade was perhaps in some ways rather regrettable. Nonetheless, people involved in it were, on the whole, good people, virtuous individuals, doing the best they could by the standards of the day, and at least it wasn't as bad as some other countries, and so forth. Now, I'll say a little bit more about some of the consequent issues in a moment, but my point is that a position which simply says there is nothing to understand in this history is not going to take us very far forward. And if we're talking about solidarity, I would say there is something of a moral imperative to solidarity with our past. An acknowledgement of the intelligibility and of the failure of our past, and that we in our present are not wholly destroyed or wholly compromised by admitting such failure, or on the other hand, by acknowledging, and here's an important point I think for the rest of this discussion, acknowledging that we have come to learn certain things. We have come to learn. So the 2 points I'd want to draw out from this general reflection, about which I'll have more to say in detail in a moment, are these. First of all, as I've just said, it's important to bear in mind that our moral positions, our moral convictions and values are learned. They do not drop from heaven. There is a process by which we acquire moral perspective over history. It doesn't always go in a single direction, let alone in the right direction. And anybody who uses in any context the argument that it's a good thing to be on the side of history needs to remember that history does not have sides. But to recognize that we have learned and are learning, to recognize that our discernment, our values and so forth are shaped by a context and a story, is one way of freeing ourselves from the idea that our positions as they now stand are so self-evident that they need no argument or defense. And the second point from all this is a degree of what's sometimes called hermeneutical charity in reading the motives of others. Not as a form of absolving them or denying the moral quality of acts, but assuming, unless we have good reason to think otherwise, that people's motivations are not so radically different from ours that we can ignore their own embedded, located humanity. And we'll see in a moment how that applies to certain current debates. So, thinking of those 2 points, the first one is about recognizing the process by which values are acquired, so as to prevent ourselves from supposing that where we stand is the obvious place to stand, the reasonable place to stand, the normative place to stand, or the human place to stand, worst of all. We need a sense that diverse questions are being addressed by diverse persons in diverse periods. And that helps us never to be uncritical of our past, but never to be in denial of it. The second point about hermeneutical charity perhaps needs a little bit more discussion. And I am conscious in treating this question of speaking of a number of neuralgic and complex current issues, very much from an outside perspective and a privileged perspective, and I give due warning of my own inadequacy. And I do mean that seriously in addressing these issues, knowing that there are many, many people who would want to speak of this from within and would do so with more credibility and more conviction. But the point of this hermeneutical charity is, to borrow a phrase from Gillian Rose again, disentangling what the investment of the other is in their view. That is, what is the positive goal, what is the good that is sought. In debates that have arisen over the last couple of decades, especially around multicultural related questions, people sometimes speak as though the religious or cultural other had a set of goals and priorities wholly alien to what our priorities are. And when, a good many years back, the near neighbourhood scheme was devised as an interfaith framework for local groups to come together, one of the things that its organisers and proponents said about it was that it simply attempted to recognise that, let's say, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu families living in a single geographical area might quite reasonably have the same concerns about road safety or environmental pollution. Nobody, if asked, would say positively, I want something unrecognizably different from you. I want the well-being of my children. I want the security of an environment. I want a shared and dependable health system. I want a good school. This is so blindingly and almost trivially clear, it seems, that I'm sometimes a little surprised we find it so difficult to frame arguments in this context. But the knowledge that in certain significant respects, the stranger has goals which are recognizable to me and values that are recognizable to me is perhaps the beginning of managing conflict in a less destructive way. But there are so many factors at work in such debates that it becomes really remarkably easy to ignore this and to construct a debate in which, as I've said already, a particular kind of absolutism and a particular kind of denialism prop each other up. Many of the debates that we're now very familiar with and which I believe are not entirely unfamiliar in this university and even in this immediate locality, debates about the legacies of empire, about the continuing legacy in terms of systemic racism of the slave trade, the legacies of colonialism and imperialism in various ways. Such debates are very often run into the sand by that curious symbiosis of what I call absolutism and denialism. It's important for us, therefore, to know, as we think through these things, something of the history, the not at all simple question of how the very idea of race was constructed in the past, how it came to be the kind of category it came to be by the early modern period in such a way as to lead otherwise not conspicuously wicked and foolish people into the indescribable wickedness and folly of the Atlantic slave trade. What was being constructed? How were the ideas being shaped, the imaginary being put together? Which is why it's not simply a bit of idle wokeism to look at how exactly, say, early modern writers, even one as great as Shakespeare, constructs, works with, handles ideas of race. How was it that the gross imbalance of power and the gross abuse of fellow human beings came to seem obvious and moral to dominant groups in the past? What was it in, let's say, again, the early modern period that stifled the intelligent questioning of this? Because there were those who asked intelligent questions about it. We need to see how the nature of hegemonic interest gradually obscures visions, notions of common interest and common humanity. And to see that process by which a great evil comes to be rationalized contextualizes a little bit the issue now as one about an evil uncovered gradually as what seemed to be recognizable reasons lose force. In other words, it's possible to recognize that given certain assumptions, people's consequent actions are not deliberately malicious. There are goods we can sort of recognize. At the same time, we see an unease, a turmoil in the debate, in the discourse, which gradually, increasingly makes certain assumptions untenable and moves us towards where we are today. But in recent years, of course, what has been done, especially in the Black Lives Matter movements, is an affirmation that what has been tacitly denied can now be affirmed, and it challenges resistors or opponents to see not simply a matter of evil habit, but false assumptions leading to the habit of ignoring current realities. In the unhelpful standoff in some circles represented by those who say, in response to BLM, well, all lives matter, it's crucial to say that's perfectly true, but completely immaterial to the situation as it now exists, where the fact is something is being denied or ignored, which is the mattering of black lives, and that is why that is now the moral priority. The necessary question, as we look at all such neuralgic issues, is, I suppose, what in the past have we been educated to ignore, and what in the present are we now being asked to ignore? Because to ignore aspects of the real is always and inevitably to step back, both from human solidarity and from that common quest for truthfulness which is built into the practice of human solidarity. If some of our 20th century writers on the subject, whom I mentioned last week, like Josef Tischner, the Polish philosopher, would argue. And that means, in turn, that what we are asked to work for now is a culture in which a narrative and a perspective that has been ignored and marginalized can be set free and allowed voice. As basic as that. The task, once this complex history has been recognized, the task is cultural reformation. And that cultural reformation is more than simply a matter of reparation, I'll come back to that in a moment, more than simply an addressing of prejudice or an educating out of prejudice. It is part of that positive, cooperative work which belongs to human solidarity. Again, I refer back to Tischner and others. Culture making. A culture making in which occluded and silenced voices are released. Reparation, and there's a very sophisticated and helpful study of this topic by Michael Banner of Trinity College, Cambridge, about to appear. Reparation is not simply about rectifying a past, but enabling culture building. And if we're assessing claims for reparation, such as have recently been acknowledged by the Church of England in this week's news, the point is, as I say, not to attempt to balance an unbalanceable moral charge sheet, but to create a different culture. All of that leaves the privileged white male speaking to you, and the privileged white males of whom there are quite a number in the audience, with a fair challenge about the nature of allyship, as people now describe it. What is it now to be an advocate and an ally in this task of culture building? Another area, and I'm very conscious this morning of treading on any number of toes, another area where similar standoffs have in some ways almost poisoned or paralyzed moral discussion is the discussion of the rights of transgender persons. where we've seen a disastrous and, I think, painfully destructive fracture of feminist solidarity as a result of the way in which certain debates have been constructed. A highly successful binarization of the issue, I might say, being a little provocative and a little ironic there. The levels of extreme dysphoria that some people experience in their birth gender identities exist as a form of the radical need for safety. It's not trivial by any means. It is in fact essential to recognize that the transgender person in their dysphoric condition feels unsafe. Not necessarily melodramatically threatened always by the violence of others, though we've seen very clearly that that can be the case, but threatened, as it might be, by their own imagining of what they can live with, their own imagining of a future of pain, conflict, and tension. A radical need for safety, which needs to be itself allowed to speak without fear. Recently, speaking on this subject, I remember someone who would identify as transgender saying there's a great deal of talk about the fear of transgendered persons. It's quite important to remember that the transgendered person also feels fear. And that's not, as I say, not trivial. But how is that brought into conversation and negotiation with the historic and grounded fear of women, that is, women who have remained with their birth identity as female, the fear of women about safe spaces? How does the abused woman react to the risk of someone originally biologically male in their space? The fear is real. The need for safety is also radical. And we've spent a couple of decades listening, I hope, listening to the ways in which that need, that radical need for safety on the part of many women, especially women who have suffered violence, listening to how that has so often been denied, ignored, or disvalued. And the point I'm struggling to make here is that the question seems to me how a cooperative, or should I even say covenantal, form of safety is created. Not in terms of competing, incompatible bundles of rights, but in terms, once again, of culture creation. How is safety ensured by each for the other? What is promisable by each to the other in avoiding this standoff? The current violence of language on both sides of the debate works against this cooperative mutual security, and so works against solidarity. But any covenanted, negotiated, mutual guarantee of safety only arises from the taking of time together, from what you might call curated opportunities for safe speaking and honest speaking, intelligent brokerage of people's expressed need. And again, a little anecdotal recollection takes me back to a seminar in Cambridge some years ago, which had been set up quite deliberately as an engagement between two Rwandans, one of whom was the daughter of a militia commander who had been active in the slaughter of one ethnic group, the other somebody whose family had been slaughtered by the militia in question. Preparing that engagement took quite a long time. You don't simply put two people together with those histories. How then do you, as I said, curate the kind of relationship, the kind of trust building, or indeed culture building, that can allow a conversation to emerge? How can you create a meeting at the end of which, as happened, thank God, in this instance, the two involved say, we probably ought to keep talking to one another? It's not just about the individuals. You don't load it all on them. You work at the context in which such an engagement takes place, and with, to use the word again, the covenanted commitment of all those present to keep an engagement alive and secure. It's not impossible, but it's an extraordinarily difficult business. Culture building is like that. But this is, again, I would say, an instance of culture building. And that has to do with recognizing the emotional seriousness of the other and the intelligibility of their desire. Above all, the intelligibility of their desire to be safe. Any rhetoric that excludes this will paralyze and exclude solidarity in any reasonable sense, as if we worked on the assumption that every transgendered woman were potentially desirous or eager to rape or assault. As if every trans-exclusionary radical feminist wished to disadvantage, disempower, or silence every trans person. As if the fears of women who had suffered abuse were fictitious or exaggerated. Culture building begins with that recognition of emotional seriousness and the intelligibility of the desire of the other. It's not the end, but the beginning of the story. It's not the end, sometimes the beginning of conflict, but a conflict which is reflected, which is thought, not simply reactive. And in all of this, I suppose that I'm trying to put some flesh on the idea I touched on last week, an idea which I've explored a little bit in a lecture on the idea of solidarity in relation to Gillian Rose's philosophy, the idea of the solidarity of speakers. Human solidarity is, in a very wide and flexible sense, a solidarity in conversation, not static, but a matter of mutual challenge, difficulty, resolution, new perspective. Our identities, our treasured identities, constantly being ventured in an exchange, taking the risk of recognition, the risk of assuming that recognition is not impossible. In a way, I suppose, this has its roots in some of the spirited and quite complex reflections that St. Paul offers us in, let's say, the letters to the Romans and the first letter to the Corinthians. I'm frequently tempted to say that it's important to remember that the New Testament exists because the early Christians quarreled. The New Testament does not exist because pious and holy early Christians, as it were in a spirit of neutral calm, set down their agreeable and self-evident moral principles. The New Testament exists because people in overcrowded, hot rooms in Mediterranean towns were screaming at one another over the remains of a meal. That's why we have the New Testament. But as St. Paul addresses some of these issues in his letters, he does so with a spirit which seems to me not a million miles away from what I've just been outlining. And what I've just been outlining has its roots very manifestly in the way Paul approaches it. The other, your Christian neighbor who ought to be at one with you in every single respect, who reads the same Bible and prays the same prayers, buys meat from the temple butchers. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to assume that buying meat from the temple butchers is always and invariably connected to a deliberate desire to compromise with idolatry and paganism and undermine the integrity of the Christian body? Or might you just be capable of thinking that the motivation of your compromised neighbour has something to do with the fact that he or she believes that the idol to whom sacrifice is offered is nothing at all, that the entire system of paganism is so empty that you really don't have to worry about it? So you buy meat from the temple butchers, and your neighbour doesn't. You look at your neighbour, and you imagine, is this somebody who is overthrowing the entire gospel by going back to the bondage of a law from which we have been liberated? Somebody whose vision of God is so deeply distorted that it is impossible for them to understand the freedom that the gospel brings? Or do you perhaps assume that your more scrupulous neighbour is somebody who is concerned not to give offence, not to give a false impression of taking seriously a system which is not to be taken seriously? Well, that's a rather unhelpfully over-elaborate paraphrase of how Paul addresses one quite complex and pressing issue in the early Christian communities. An invitation to understand the other's behavior in terms of what they think obedience to God requires, not to cast it as instantly as deliberate, malicious, elaborated, thought-through disobedience to a clear command. And I think that's a very positive way of looking at hermeneutical charity, as I described it, not simply thinking the best in a rather vague and perhaps rather sentimental way about your neighbour, but seeing how you could possibly arrive at such a conclusion from some of the things that you share. That kind of perspective, I would just say in passing, seems to me to have been singularly absent in a great deal of the debates that have racked my own church about sexuality over the last couple of decades. But that is another story, and with ill-concealed relief, I'll pass on and leave you to draw what conclusions might be drawn there. Grasp what the neighbour is seeking. Don't assume a corrupt, alien, violent purpose. An ethic that has something to do with solidarity, let alone a Christian ethic that has something to do with solidarity, involves the obligation to ask, what am I assuming about the other's motivation and its sources? What am I assuming, to go back to a point I made earlier, about the nature of the learning of the other? How has the other come to this place? By what journey? And that means, of course, looking at my own history. How have I come to this place? And when I begin to recognize, to make the point again, that my view, my perspective is learned, not obvious, I may still cling to it, I may still believe the learning that I have undergone, but I will be aware of the stages of learning, the factors at work that press me this way or that, which, as Cardinal Newman famously outlined in the Grammar of Assent, are not always the kind of reasoned arguments and infallible and impregnable conclusions that we'd like them to be. Absent this, and what do we have left? We have left the mythology of impenetrably unrecognizable goals and unintelligible evil in the other. We have at the far end of that spectrum the QAnon phenomenon, where the motivation of those who disagree is not simply a disagreement about politics, but a satanic global plot. And if we don't want to end up with a nice symmetry of satanic global plots dividing us person from person as well as group from group at the end of the day, the labor, the task of recognition remains imperative for us. recognizing the goals of others, allows us, impels us to that labor of culture construction, as I've put it, even where convergence is unstable, incomplete, and deeply vulnerable. As I've said, this is not an alibi for conflict. It's not a sentimental illusion about what can be readily achieved. If my own views have not dropped from heaven in timeless self-evidence, then there is no dropping from heaven of a consensus that will be invulnerable to change and challenge. We continue to speak, continue to talk, and in that process, embrace whatever shared space opens up. And we continue to interrogate, as sharply and as clearly as we can, the various kinds of unspoken, unrecognized, unthought imbalances of power in which we're involved. I investigate, in a good conversation, not only my own frontiers, but my own privilege. But finally, pulling this together and again throwing out a bit of a bridge to the next and final session, why do we bother? Self-preservation is no bad motive in many respects, and there is a pragmatic aspect to working towards recognition and building common culture, if only for the bare reason that the dangerous and unintelligible other is not simply going to vanish because I want them to. Rule number one of democratic elections, despite practice in several countries of the world, rule number one of democratic elections is that the minority does not disappear the day after the election. Therefore, that important democratic principle of losers' consent comes into focus. Those who do not win in a democratic process must have something in which they can recognize their interest to be invested in the outcome, rather than simply being subjected to a victory dance over their tender parts by the winners. But there is something deeper than the mere pragmatics of this. Our common materiality, our embodied life in a material world, our locatedness, our dependence and our frailty as agents insist upon the commonness of so many tasks. We live in a material world whose material processes have been signally and in some ways almost fatally distorted by human failing, human greed, human sin. That means that in an environment in which the boundaries of ethnic and class distinction do not necessarily prevail in the natural order, our challenges are common challenges. I've frequently in the past few years found myself repeating the nostrum that crises don't read maps. Environmental disaster does not go by geography, and pandemics do not carry passports. If this is the case, then whatever the divisions between ourselves as human agents, groups of human agents, nations of human agents, there are issues which, by the very fact of our embodiedness in the world, insist, so to speak, upon our cooperation, our common work, our culture making. And at the end of the day, moving gradually from the pragmatic to the more openly theological, if what we say about God's purpose in the creation of the human and the redemption of the human is true, then the diversity we experience in our world is indeed both disturbing and promising. We are made in the image of God, says the first chapter of the book of Genesis. That in whose image we are made is a God who makes life. The image of God, it seems, must have something to do with the giving of life, with the exchange of life. And the diversity of the world we're in, human and non-human, has something to do with the immeasurable variety of sources from which life comes to the particular agent, the particular person or speaker. And so we can speak of a communion of difference, a communion in which the currency is the exchange of life. Because our egos are incapable of resourcing ourselves, teaching ourselves to speak, teaching ourselves to love. Our egos are incapable of seeing the entire field in which we act and think and work. And so, the stranger, the other, whose perspective is often so difficult to recognize and acknowledge, is also the necessary object of love and thanksgiving, because the source of life within the providence of the Creator. And in the final lecture, I want to draw out a little bit further how that might help us recast slightly some of the ideas we work with about human rights and human dignity, and finally enable us to connect a little bit more closely the themes of solidarity, as I've outlined them, with a more comprehensive Christian anthropology, a doctrine of the human. So that's what we'll come back to after the break. And once again, thank you very much for listening with patience.